Welcome to a journey through one of the most unsettling stories ever to emerge from the Appalachian region. Today, we'll explore the mystery that haunted the Virginia mountains back in 1921, a time when the quiet of those woods concealed secrets that were never meant to surface. If you're watching along, share in the comments where you're tuning in from. Let's begin. The Virginia Appalachians have always carried a haunting atmosphere, misty ridges cloaked in fog, valleys so deep sunlight could barely touch them, and isolated towns that seemed frozen in another century. It was the fall of 1921, and the chill of winter had begun creeping into Wise County. The dirt roads, worn and unkept, turned every trip into a dangerous ordeal, especially after the rains transformed them into muddy streams. The mountain families survived through hunting, small gardens, and long, grueling shifts in the coal mines. Life was unforgiving, and the law, when it came at all, often came too late. Among the people of this rugged land was Marybelle Carter, a woman whose presence could not go unnoticed. At just 32, she had become the subject of countless whispers in the small communities near Norton, a quiet mining town hidden among the peaks. Marybelle did not live by the rules expected of women in her time. She traveled alone, traded property, bargained with men, and wasn't afraid to speak her mind, something that made many uneasy. Her jet black hair always pulled tight her sharp gaze, and confident stride made her impossible to ignore. She lived in isolation on a high ridge surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to keep her secrets. Visitors were rare. Those who braved the winding trail to her home told strange tales, of faint lights flickering through her windows at dawn, of voices carried by still air, and of an oppressive feeling that made their skin crawl. When Marybelle came down to town to trade or buy supplies, conversations would hush, and curious eyes followed her every move. The first sign that something was wrong came in mid-October. A nearby farmer, Thomas Belmont, reported to the local sheriff that he had noticed strange goings on near Marybelle's cabin. He said that while walking the trail, he spotted fresh wagon and horse tracks, unusual for someone who lived alone, and caught a foul odor drifting from her direction, a stench so strong it made him nauseous. Sheriff Harold Pritchard, a man accustomed to local gossip, dismissed the claim at first. Marybelle had long been the subject of unfounded talk, and he saw little reason to interfere based on rumors. But within days, another report reached his desk. A woman named Estelle Monroe arrived at the sheriff's office, visibly distressed. Her brother, Leonard Monroe, a traveling salesman, had visited Marybelle's property 3 weeks earlier, and had not been heard from since. Leonard was known for his reliability, sending letters home every 10 days, yet weeks had now passed in silence. Estelle pleaded for the sheriff to look into it. Pritchard, still unconvinced, promised to check on things, but no action followed. Then came the third and most troubling report. A group of hunters, exploring the upper slopes near Marybelle's land, stumbled upon abandoned belongings in a clearing. A leather satchel, cooking tools, and papers identifying the owner as Leonard Monroe. They carried the items back to town, forcing the sheriff to confront what he had been avoiding. That same day, Pritchard gathered 2 deputies and decided to climb up to Marybelle Carter's property to uncover the truth behind the mountain rumors. The hike was grueling, the slope steep, the ground slick with wet leaves, and the fog thick enough to obscure the path. The men couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes followed them from the shadows. When they finally reached the cabin, the silence was absolute. No birds, no rustling branches, only the low moan of the wind through bare trees. At first glance, the place looked deserted. The windows were shut tight, and the door was barred. The sheriff knocked several times, calling her name, but there was no reply. After a long pause, he ordered the door forced open. What awaited inside would be burned into their memories forever. The air was heavy and foul, the darkness nearly complete. The curtains were drawn, blocking out what little daylight there was. A damp, decaying smell lingered in the air, mixed with something so strange it made the men cover their faces. Pritchard lit a lantern and took in the room. It looked as if someone had left in a hurry. Unwashed dishes filled the sink, clothing lay scattered across a chair, and the ashes in the fireplace were still warm. Someone had been there recently. The cabin itself was humble, filled with worn furniture and a table piled with papers, business notes, transaction records, and scraps of writing that made little sense. The sheriff scanned a few under the lantern glow. He recognized familiar names, locals from the nearby towns, alongside recent dates and amounts of money. It all hinted at trade or deals, but nothing explained Leonard Monroe's disappearance or the rumors haunting the place. One of the deputies drew the sheriff's attention to a half-open door at the back. It led downward. A cellar. Pritchard felt his chest tighten. Cellars were common in these mountains, usually for storing food through the winter. But something about this one felt wrong. He descended the wooden steps carefully, each creak echoing in the confined space. The smell grew stronger with every step. When he reached the bottom, the lantern's light revealed a scene that made his blood run cold. The cellar was larger than expected, a carved-out chamber built into the mountain rock itself. Crude shelves lined the walls, but instead of food or tools, they held glass jars filled with dark liquids, wooden boxes nailed shut with rusted iron, and personal belongings that clearly didn't all belong to one person. Scattered across the cellar were shoes of different sizes, worn hats, travel bags, pocket watches, and rings, as though someone had been collecting the possessions of passing strangers. Sheriff Pritchard called his deputies over, and together they began to take mental note of the disturbing scene before them. Among the piles, they found a leather wallet containing identification papers belonging to Leonard Monroe. That single discovery confirmed their worst fears. But Leonard wasn't the only victim. Other items clearly belonged to several different people, perhaps 5 or 6 in total. As Pritchard examined the papers more closely, he recognized some of the names. They were traveling merchants, drifters, and peddlers who had once passed through the county, all of whom had mysteriously vanished over the past few years. Then one of the deputies uncovered something hidden beneath a heap of old fabric, a diary. Its pages, yellowed with age, were filled with neat cursive handwriting unmistakably belonging to Marybelle Carter. The earliest entries dated back to 1918, 3 years prior. In the beginning, her words were mundane. Reflections on her lonely life in the mountains, her struggles to make ends meet, and her growing resentment toward the locals who scorned and avoided her. But as the months passed in the journal, the tone shifted. Her writing grew darker. She began mentioning opportunities, people who came through the area and might never be missed, and hinted at doing whatever it took to survive. The final entries were chilling. Marybelle described encounters with travelers, a man selling fabric who stayed for supper and was never seen again, another who brought her tools and spent the night when a storm rolled in, and a third who came to negotiate a land purchase and vanished before reaching the valley below. Her words were fragmented, but the meaning was unmistakable. Marybelle Carter had found her own way to survive, by making others disappear. A cold dread settled over Sheriff Pritchard. What they had uncovered was far worse than anyone could have imagined. That lonely cabin wasn't just a home. It had been the center of a string of disappearances that had haunted Wise County for years. He immediately ordered his men to gather every item that could serve as evidence. They had to find Marybelle, and fast. As they worked, one of the deputies noticed strange markings on the dirt floor, long, deep grooves, as though something heavy had been dragged repeatedly toward one of the walls. On closer inspection, they saw that part of the stone wall had been disturbed. Someone had removed and replaced sections of rock, creating a crude hidden chamber. Using makeshift tools, the deputies pried away the stones. What lay beyond made even the most hardened men recoil. Behind the wall was a concealed space carved into the mountain itself. Inside were the horrific remnants of what Marybelle had hidden for years, evidence that left no room for doubt. The sheriff and his deputies realized they were standing in the aftermath of something monstrous. The truth about what had happened on that mountain was now undeniable. Word spread like wildfire. By evening, the entire Wise County region was buzzing with the news of the discovery at Marybelle Carter's property. Gossip flew faster than facts, whispered in taverns, murmured in church pews, debated in every corner of town. Sheriff Pritchard, understanding the weight of the situation, sent messengers to nearby counties requesting help. Marybelle had vanished, and the manhunt began at once. Investigators arrived to carefully document every detail, cataloging each object, logging every letter, examining every scrap of evidence that might reveal what had truly happened in that isolated cabin. Among the belongings were unsent letters, written in hopeful tones by travelers who never made it home. One letter, penned by a man named William Hodges, spoke of a successful trade with a kind woman in the mountains, and his plans to return home soon to buy seeds for the next planting season. That letter was found, unopened, among the rest of the victim's things. Soon, the story reached the press. The Norton Gazette, the county's leading newspaper, ran a front-page article that stunned even those who doubted the rumors. The headline read, "Disturbing discoveries in the Wise Mountains reveal dark secrets." The article avoided gruesome details but made it clear. Authorities believed several people had been killed. At least 6 victims had been identified through personal belongings discovered in the cabin, all missing travelers who had passed through between 1918 and 1921. The community quickly divided. Some were convinced Marybelle Carter was a cold-blooded killer who lured innocent travelers for profit. Others, however, recalled her tragedy, the loss of her husband in a mining accident back in 1916, and the years of hardship that followed, with no family, no income, and a society that offered little mercy to widowed women. Some wondered if isolation and despair had driven her to madness. Meanwhile, the search widened. Groups of armed volunteers and deputies combed the woods, ravines, and caves, their lanterns flickering against the vast Appalachian wilderness. Finding a single person in that unforgiving terrain was nearly impossible. As late October brought colder winds, fears grew that Marybelle might not survive long in the wilderness, especially if she was injured or without provisions. Then, on the 5th day of the search, a rancher named Elijah Booker arrived at the sheriff's office with vital information. He said that 2 days before the gruesome discovery, he had seen a woman matching Marybelle's description walking south along an old hunter's trail that led toward the Lee County line. She carried a large pack on her back, avoided eye contact, and seemed to be in a hurry. At the time, Elijah hadn't thought much of it. But now, realizing its significance, he came forward. Sheriff Pritchard wasted no time. He organized a new expedition, sending his men southward along the route Booker had described. The hunt for Marybelle Carter was far from over. But the truth of what she left behind in those mountains had already changed Wise County forever. The trail ahead was treacherous, riddled with ravines and stretches where the ground could collapse without warning. It was rarely traveled, making it the perfect escape route for someone trying to vanish into the wilderness. At first light, Sheriff Pritchard and his men set out, armed and prepared for the unforgiving climb through the Virginia highlands. As the search pressed on, more fragments of Marybelle Carter's life came to light. Locals who had once been reluctant to speak now offered pieces of her story. Dorothy Simmons, a townswoman, recalled that Marybelle would appear in town after long absences, always with enough money to buy food and supplies in large quantities. A mystery considering her well-known financial troubles. Another man, Albert Rhines, a shopkeeper, confessed that over the years Marybelle had tried to sell him jewelry and fine watches, items he now suspected had once belonged to the missing travelers. Bit by bit, a clearer picture emerged, that of a woman who had crossed a line from hardship into horror. Yet questions still hung heavy in the air. How had she persuaded strangers to linger at her cabin? What exactly had happened on those cold, silent nights? And most of all, where was she now? The atmosphere in Wise County grew tense. Families locked their doors before dusk, travelers avoided the backroads, and rumors spread like wildfire. Fear took hold. The idea that Marybelle might still be out there, hiding in the dark watching. The case had evolved beyond crime. It had become a grim legend, a symbol of what isolation, despair, and human neglect could create deep within the Appalachian shadows. The search party following the southern trail soon faced worsening terrain. The path that Elijah Booker had described narrowed until it became little more than a game trail winding through steep hillsides. The forest canopy grew so dense that daylight barely reached the ground, shrouding everything in an eerie half-light. Each step had to be tested. One misstep could send a man sliding down into the canyons that yawned suddenly at their sides. On the 3rd day of the search, they found their first real clue. A small, cold campfire still held faint traces of fresh ash. Someone had been there not long before. Footprints surrounded the spot, likely from one person, and their size matched that of a woman. Pritchard felt both relief and unease. They were close. But it also meant Marybelle was still moving swiftly despite the harsh terrain and the weight she carried. Following the trail, the group descended into a place known locally as Raven's Gorge, a narrow chasm carved by a mountain stream. The gorge had a dark reputation among locals. Tales of travelers vanishing, swallowed by fog or slipping from the cliffs into the depths below. Even the air there carried a strange quality. The echoes of footsteps and voices seemed to multiply, twisting around the rocks in unnatural ways. It was on the creek bank that they discovered more evidence. A woolen blanket draped over a low branch, still damp from washing, and impressions in the dirt showing where someone had rested. The sheriff ordered the men to fan out while keeping each other in sight. The last thing they needed was another disappearance in those cursed hills. Then one of the trackers, Jesse Tate, spotted something odd. Faint scratch marks along a rock face, suggesting someone had climbed upward. Following the signs, he found the narrow entrance to a small cave hidden beneath thick vines. He called out, and the group carefully approached. The cave was shallow, no more than a few meters deep, but it offered shelter from wind and rain. Inside, they found signs that confirmed recent used bits of food, a half-empty bottle of water, and a torn strip of cloth that looked like a makeshift bandage. But Marybelle herself was gone. She had slipped away again, likely realizing pursuit was near. What stopped the sheriff in his tracks was a notebook, half buried under loose stones near the back of the cave. Opening it, he immediately recognized the familiar, elegant handwriting, the same as the diary from the cabin. These entries were recent, written during her flight through the mountains. In the pages, Marybelle poured out the torment consuming her. She wrote of sleepless nights haunted by the faces of those she had deceived, of regret gnawing at her conscience. The first killing, she said, had been an accident, a heated argument that spiraled out of control. But once that boundary was crossed, each act afterward felt somehow inevitable. Her words revealed a mind unraveling, torn between guilt and a desperate need to justify her choices. She claimed she had only wanted to survive, that the people she took in were strangers, forgotten souls like her. In one passage, she confessed she had thought about surrendering herself, but fear, of shame, of judgment, of the gallows, kept her running. Pritchard closed the notebook with a heavy sigh. Nothing written there excused her crimes, yet it offered a glimpse into how despair and solitude could warp the human spirit. Poverty, abandonment, and the crushing weight of loneliness had created a darkness that festered unchecked, until the unthinkable became possible. Still, there were real victims, and justice demanded answers. The search now took on a new urgency. The notebook hinted that Marybelle was hurt, possibly with a twisted ankle, which explained her frequent stops. That injury might slow her enough for them to catch up. As they pressed farther south, the wilderness began to thin. The dense forests opened into stony ridges and exposed slopes, where the trees gave way to rock and scrub. It made the travel easier, but hiding places scarcer. Marybelle's world was shrinking. Every mile narrowed her escape, and Pritchard knew. The end of the chase was near. The sun was dipping below the horizon when movement flickered across the distant ridge. A lone figure, limping slowly along the uneven rocks. Sheriff Pritchard lifted his binoculars and his suspicions were confirmed. It was Marybelle Carter. After days of relentless pursuit, the search had come to an end. The sheriff and his men spread out, surrounding the area to block any chance of escape. The final confrontation was moments away. Pritchard motioned for a careful approach. The last thing he wanted was to push her into panic. Not after coming this far. Marybelle hadn't noticed them yet. She was too focused on the difficult path ahead, her injured leg slowing her down. The golden light of dusk stretched long shadows over the rocks, giving the scene a surreal stillness. When they were close enough for her to hear, the sheriff called out her name. Marybelle froze, her body went rigid as if struck by an unseen force. Slowly, she turned. Her face was drawn and pale, marked by exhaustion and sleepless nights. But beyond the fatigue was an expression of acceptance, a quiet understanding that the chase was over. She didn't run or resist. She simply stood there on the ridge's edge, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. Sheriff Pritchard stepped closer, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. He told her they needed to go back, that there were questions left unanswered and families who deserved the truth. Marybelle remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the last rays of sunlight bled into the mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled but carried a strange calm. She said she had known there was no escape, that from the moment she left her cabin, she expected this outcome. She explained she hadn't run to evade justice, but to come to terms with what she had done, to confront the person she had become. In the solitude of the mountains, she had replayed every decision, every moment when she could have chosen differently. When the sheriff asked about the travelers and what had really taken place in that cabin, Marybelle closed her eyes before answering. The first time, she said, had not been planned. In 1918, a merchant named Richard Dawson had stopped by her property to sell tools. A storm was coming, and he stayed for supper. During the meal, an argument broke out over an old debt she couldn't pay. Things escalated, and in the chaos, tragedy struck. Overcome with fear, Marybelle hid the evidence, knowing that as a poor, solitary woman with a stained reputation, the law would show no mercy. After that night, the world changed for her. The boundary between right and wrong blurred. When another traveler arrived months later, a man carrying enough money to see her through the winter, she gave in to temptation. One crime turned into many. Each act became easier to justify, easier to silence her guilt. The strangers who crossed her path became faceless, not people, but solutions to her desperate circumstances. Marybelle spoke of the crushing loneliness in that mountain cabin, nights that stretched endlessly, silence so deep it felt alive. Bitterness had taken root, twisting her thoughts until the world seemed cruel and distant. She blamed everyone for her suffering, believing she'd been abandoned and forgotten. The sheriff listened in heavy silence, his face carved with sorrow. The men behind him shifted uneasily, some unable to meet her gaze. Marybelle went on, saying there were times she had almost confessed, times she walked into town ready to surrender, only to turn back, paralyzed by fear of the gallows. When she finished, she looked drained, hollowed out by her own words. Slowly, she extended her wrists toward the sheriff, a silent plea for it all to end. Pritchard stepped forward and secured the iron cuffs around her wrists. The metallic snap echoed through the quiet gorge like a closing chapter. The group began their descent, moving slowly to match Marybelle's limp. It took 2 days to reach the valley. She spoke no more during the journey, lost somewhere deep within herself. By the time they arrived in Norton, word had spread. A large crowd filled the streets, some shouting curses, others simply staring in stunned silence. The sheriff guided her through, shielding her from the angry mob until they reached the county jail. Inside, Marybelle was placed in a small, cold cell, her final refuge. The stone walls pressed in, and the single barred window allowed only a sliver of moonlight. She sat on the hard cot and stared at her hands, the same hands that had worked the soil, prepared meals, and committed the deeds that would forever define her name. The silence inside the cell felt nothing like the silence of the mountains. This was not the quiet of wind and trees, but a heavier stillness, one of endings, of doors sealed shut, of a life that had run out of tomorrows. In the days following Marybelle Carter's capture, Wise County was thrown into turmoil unlike anything it had seen before. The sleepy town of Norton, usually steady and predictable, became the center of a regional storm. Reporters poured in from neighboring counties, notebooks and cameras in hand, eager to chronicle what was already being called the Appalachian horror. The Norton Gazette printed special editions daily, and each issue sold out within hours. People were desperate to understand how something so monstrous had unfolded so close to home. How a woman who had lived among them, even if at the fringes, could have hidden such darkness for so long. Sheriff Pritchard formed a special unit dedicated to unraveling every thread of Marybelle's past and identifying her victims. It was a daunting task. Records from the region were incomplete at best, especially in the remote mountain settlements where many lived without any documentation. Traveling merchants were nearly impossible to trace. They drifted constantly between towns and counties, often vanishing from contact for months without raising alarm. Investigators began examining every item recovered from Marybelle's cabin, trying to link each to a missing person. A silver pocket watch engraved with the initials W.H. was traced to William Hodges, a draper from Kentucky who had disappeared in 1919. His family, contacted by telegraph, confirmed that his last letter mentioned plans to cross the Virginia mountains. A letter later found among Marybelle's belongings unsent. A plain gold wedding ring inscribed, "To Leonard, with eternal love," was identified by Leonard Monroe's sister, who broke down in tears when she held it. Leonard, a kind-hearted man who often helped strangers, had likely stopped to aid Marble, unaware of the danger awaiting him. His widow, who had spent years in uncertainty, now faced the grim truth. Each recovered object told its own tragic story. Every identification reopened wounds that time had only begun to numb. A Tennessee blacksmith recognized a pair of handmade boots as the ones he had crafted for his cousin, a hunter who vanished in 1920. A weathered Bible bore the name of an itinerant preacher whose congregation in West Virginia had prayed endlessly for his safe return. Prayers that would never be answered. As the investigation deepened, the county prosecutor, Theodore Blackwood, began preparing for trial. Known for his stern sense of justice, Blackwood publicly vowed to pursue the harshest possible punishment. To him, this case was about more than one woman's crimes. It was about reaffirming the rule of law, proving that even in the wildest reaches of the Appalachians, justice would not be denied. Marybelle's defense was assigned to a court-appointed attorney, Samuel Garrett, a middle-aged man known for his empathy and his belief that every person, no matter their crime, deserved a fair defense. Over the following weeks, Garrett visited her cell frequently, searching for any argument that might spare her life. Through their conversations, fragments of Marybelle's tragic past began to emerge. She told him of her childhood in a poor mining family, of losing 3 brothers to sickness and accidents before she was grown. She married at 16, hoping to escape poverty, but her husband's descent into alcoholism shattered that dream. 5 years later, a mining accident made her a widow, alone, destitute, and burdened with debt. She described the years that followed as a slow descent, washing clothes, sewing, taking any work she could find, all while enduring the hostility of those around her. Men preyed on her vulnerability, women shunned her as a threat. Eventually, she withdrew entirely, retreating to a remote cabin where, at least, judgment and shame could not reach her. Garrett knew her hardships could never justify her crimes, but he hoped the jury might see her not as a monster, but as a broken soul shaped by relentless suffering. He would argue that her isolation and poverty had eroded her sanity, that her actions, though inexcusable, were born from despair rather than cruelty. Meanwhile, the press kept the public captivated. Newspapers across the region printed lurid stories, some depicting Marybelle as a cold-blooded predator, others casting her as a tragic figure driven mad by solitude. Dramatic sketches showed her cabin wreathed in fog, or portrayed her as a spectral woman haunting the mountains. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, far messier and far more human than the papers suggested. As the trial approached, families of the victims began arriving in Norton. They came seeking closure, faces etched with grief and anger. The town's small hotel overflowed, and locals opened their homes to accommodate the visitors. An air of tense anticipation hung over everything, as though the entire community was waiting for justice, or perhaps redemption. Inside her cell, Marybelle lived in near silence. She refused most meals, eating just enough to survive. Occasionally, she asked for scraps of paper from the sheriff, filling them with reflections on her life, on the choices that had led her there, and the remorse that consumed her. In one note she wrote that the hardest part wasn't the fear of dying. It was the burden of remembering. Reverend Marcus Sullivan, a kind-hearted priest from the local parish, began visiting her regularly. Not to condemn, he said, but to listen. And in those quiet meetings, surrounded by stone and shadow, Marybelle Carter spoke more freely than she ever had before, not to defend her sins, but to face them. Marybelle, who had never been particularly devout, accepted Reverend Sullivan's visits less for spiritual guidance than for the brief reprieve they offered from the suffocating monotony of her cell. The Reverend, gentle but persistent, spoke to her about repentance and the search for inner peace, though both understood that her time to find it was rapidly running out. The trial was scheduled to begin during the first week of December 1921. The courthouse was prepared to hold as many spectators as possible, though everyone knew the space would never be enough. Hundreds wanted to witness what was certain to become one of the most infamous trials in the county's history. Only a fraction would get inside. Presiding over the case was Judge Harold Morrison, a man known for his stern integrity and absolute insistence on order. He warned that the courtroom was a place of justice, not theater, and any sign of emotional outburst or chaos would not be tolerated. As the date drew near, tension blanketed Norton. Conversations in homes, taverns, and churches all circled the same questions. What had driven Marybelle Carter to such darkness? Could loneliness and desperation truly twist a person's soul so completely? Or had the evil been there all along, waiting for the right moment to surface? These were questions without clear answers, and perhaps they never would have any. To many, the case had become something larger than a single woman's crimes. It was a grim mirror reflecting the community's own failures, its neglect, its judgment, its indifference to the forgotten souls surviving in the shadows of the mountains. The morning of the trial arrived cold and grey, a thick fog shrouding Norton in the damp chill of Appalachian winter. Long before sunrise, people crowded outside the courthouse, desperate for the few available seats. Those who couldn't get inside lingered in the square, awaiting word from messengers who would carry updates throughout the day. Marybelle was escorted from her cell under tight guard. She wore a plain dark dress donated by a local woman, her graying hair pulled back in a simple knot. Despite her exhaustion, she carried herself with a quiet dignity. When she entered the courtroom, an uneasy silence fell. Dozens of faces turned toward her, some filled with hatred, others with pity, and a few with something harder to define, perhaps a flicker of understanding. Judge Morrison opened the proceedings with measured words, reminding everyone that this was a court of law. Order and civility, he said, must prevail. Prosecutor Theodore Blackwood rose first. His voice was steady, authoritative, and edged with restrained fury. He laid out the facts with precision. The discovery of the victim's belongings, the diary entries implicating Marybelle, and the evidence painstakingly collected from her property. Sheriff Pritchard was called to the stand, recounting what he and his men had found in the hidden cellar. He spared the most gruesome details but made clear the horror of what had taken place. Then came the families. Leonard Monroe's sister spoke first, her voice trembling as she described her brother, a kind man, always helping strangers, whose wife and daughters had waited for him in vain. She broke down midway through her testimony, and many in the gallery turned away to hide their tears. Next came Martha Hodges, the wife of the missing merchant. Frail and soft-spoken, she described the endless years of uncertainty, clinging to hope that her husband was still alive somewhere. Learning the truth, she said, was both a relief and a torment. Relief that the waiting was over. Torment that his end had been so cruel. She looked directly at Marybelle as she spoke, searching her face for any sign of remorse. A Tennessee man testified next, the cousin of a hunter who had vanished in 1920. He described his cousin's deep familiarity with the region, his love of the wilderness, and his certainty that he'd never have been lost by accident. "Now I know," he said softly, "and I wish I didn't." When it was the defense's turn, Samuel Garrett rose with calm determination. He didn't attempt to refute the evidence. To do so would have been futile. Instead, he painted a broader picture of who Marybelle Carter had been before tragedy and isolation consumed her. He called an old neighbor, who reluctantly took the stand. The woman described how Marybelle had once cared for her family when her husband was ill, bringing food and medicine without expecting anything in return. She spoke of the loneliness that seemed to cling to her, how her eyes had grown hollow long before the crimes began. It didn't excuse what she had done, the witness said, but it showed the depth of the suffering that had shaped her. Reverend Sullivan also testified. He told the court of their conversations, of nights when Marybelle lay awake, tormented by nightmares of her victims. He made it clear he wasn't there to defend her deeds, only to tell the truth, that he had seen real remorse, not the fear of punishment, but the anguish of conscience. Then, in a move that startled everyone, Garrett called Marybelle herself to the stand. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Prosecutor Blackwood objected, warning that her testimony could harm her own defense. Judge Morrison paused, then allowed it, provided that Marybelle understood the risks. Marybelle rose, her steps slow but steady. She placed one hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice faint yet unwavering. Garrett began with gentle questions. Her name, her background, her recollection of those years in the mountains. As the entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to hear the woman whose name had become synonymous with fear finally speak for herself, Garrett began gently, asking questions about Marybelle's life, her upbringing, the years of hardship, and the loneliness that had shaped her existence. She responded plainly, without trying to elicit sympathy, describing the realities of her difficult life with a steady, almost detached honesty. But when he asked about the events themselves, her composure faltered. Taking a deep breath, Marybelle admitted what everyone already suspected: she was responsible for the disappearances. There was no escaping that truth. Her voice trembled as she explained how each tragedy had begun differently, but followed a familiar pattern. Strangers would arrive seeking food or shelter, and she would welcome them out of habit or need. At some point, something would go wrong. An argument, a moment of fear or anger, and the line between survival and sin would blur. She spoke first of Richard Dawson, the man whose death marked the beginning of everything. It had started, she said, as a confrontation that spiraled out of control. In the panic that followed, she made a series of decisions. To hide what had happened, to protect herself instead of confess. That would define the rest of her life. Each time afterward, the moral distance grew shorter, the justifications easier. Eventually, she said through tears, I didn't recognize myself anymore. Then she turned toward the front row, where the victims' families sat. Tears streaked her face as she addressed them directly. No apology, she said, could ever undo what she had done. No words could mend the pain she had caused. She acknowledged that her victims had been real people, fathers, husbands, sons, and that for years she had forced herself to see them as faceless strangers just to keep living with what she had done. Now, she said quietly, I see them as they were, and I can't close my eyes to it anymore. When Prosecutor Blackwood rose for cross-examination, his tone was sharp and unrelenting. He pressed her to confront every contradiction in her story, forcing her to admit that she had multiple chances to stop, and chose not to. He asked if her tears were born of true remorse or fear of the noose. Marybelle didn't hesitate. Both, she said. I wish I could say otherwise, but I can't separate my guilt from my fear. The questioning dragged on for hours. By the end, Marybelle seemed hollowed out, her face ashen, her hands trembling. She returned to her seat beside Garrett, shoulders hunched under the weight of everything she had confessed. The silence that followed was suffocating, the entire courtroom absorbing the enormity of what they had just witnessed. The next day brought the closing arguments. Prosecutor Blackwood's speech was fierce and resolute. He demanded the harshest sentence, arguing that justice for the victims demanded nothing less. Society, he said, must draw a line between compassion and accountability. Many people suffer, he reminded the jury, yet they do not murder. Mercy, he insisted, would dishonor the memory of the dead. When Garrett stood for the defense, his voice was steady but subdued. He did not ask for acquittal. Such a plea would have been meaningless in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Instead, he appealed to the jury's humanity. He asked them to see Marybelle not just as a monster, but as a broken soul shaped by despair and abandonment. Killing her, he said softly, will not bring the victims home. It will not heal these families. Perhaps the greater punishment is to live, to carry the burden of her deeds for the rest of her life. When the jury retired, the waiting began. For 3 long days Norton seemed suspended in time. People gathered outside the courthouse, in taverns and church halls, whispering predictions. Some were convinced the gallows awaited her, others argued that life in prison would be a more fitting sentence. Inside the courthouse, the victims' families lingered together, strangers united by shared grief. Martha Hodges spent hours speaking with Leonard Monroe's sister. They discovered how similar their husbands had been, kind, generous, trusting men whose goodness had led them to tragedy. In their shared mourning, a fragile bond formed, one of the few lights in so much darkness. Inside the jury room, 12 local men wrestled with impossible questions. They had been chosen for their supposed impartiality, yet most knew Marybelle by sight or reputation. Their debates were intense. Some insisted the law was clear, justice demanded death. Others struggled with the moral weight of that decision. Benjamin Winters, a farmer who had lost his wife years earlier, spoke for many when he admitted his own conflict. He understood loneliness, the crushing silence of the mountains, the way isolation could erode a person's mind. But then he thought of the victims, travelers who had trusted a stranger's kindness and never gone home. Where does understanding end? He asked quietly, and justice begin? While the jury deliberated, Marybelle sat alone in her cell. She no longer wrote in her diary or spoke much at all. Reverend Sullivan continued to visit, offering prayers and scripture, though he suspected his words barely reached her. She seemed to dwell somewhere beyond human comfort, locked in her own silent reckoning with what she had done. On the third afternoon, the heavy stillness of Norton shattered when a messenger burst from the courthouse with the news the jury had reached a verdict. Within minutes, the streets were crowded again. Marybelle was led back into the courtroom, escorted by Sheriff Pritchard and 2 deputies. Her movements were mechanical, her eyes unfocused, as if she had already left the world around her. Judge Morrison took his seat, face grave and lined with exhaustion. The 12 jurors filed in, avoiding Marybelle's gaze, a silence heavier than any words. When the judge asked if they had reached a decision, the foreman, David Hutchinson, stood slowly. The faint rustle of his coat echoed through the courtroom as he cleared his throat and prepared to speak. When the foreman finally spoke, his voice was firm but somber. The jury, he declared, had reached a unanimous verdict guilty on all counts of murder. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, followed by a collective intake of breath. Few were surprised, yet the finality of the words struck with the weight of a hammer. Marybelle didn't move. Her expression remained distant, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the walls. It was as though the verdict had simply confirmed what she had already accepted long before. Judge Morrison then proceeded to the sentencing phase. Prosecutor Blackwood rose first, his tone grave and resolute. He argued that nothing short of the maximum penalty would suffice, not out of vengeance, but out of duty to the law, the victims, and society itself. He spoke on behalf of those who could no longer speak, reminding the court that justice must remain absolute, even in the face of tragedy. Mercy, he said, has its place, but not when confronted with the deliberate taking of innocent lives. When it was Samuel Garrett's turn, he stood quietly for a moment before beginning. He did not attempt to lessen the horror of the crimes or dispute the evidence. Instead, he appealed to conscience, to the idea that justice did not have to mean execution. There are punishments beyond death, he said softly. Let her live, Your Honor. Let her carry this burden until her final breath. He asked that the court consider the full picture, a life shaped by poverty, isolation, and despair, not as excuses, but as part of a tragic chain of cause and effect. Judge Morrison listened in silence, his weathered hands folded on the bench. When the time came, he looked at Marybelle and asked her to rise. She stood slowly, steadying herself on the wooden table. He began with measured words, acknowledging the enormity of the crimes, the irreparable suffering of the families, and the necessity of upholding the rule of law. His voice, calm but heavy with emotion, filled the room. Then, after a long pause that seemed to stretch on forever, he pronounced the sentence: death by hanging, to be carried out within 60 days. The air left the room in a single breath. Some nodded grimly, believing justice had been done. Others bowed their heads, unable to take satisfaction in another life ending, no matter how justly. Among the victims' families, the reactions varied. A few whispered prayers of thanks, while others simply wept in silence, realizing that no verdict could ever bring back what was lost. Marybelle did not flinch. She simply lowered her eyes and allowed the guards to escort her away. It was as if she had known this moment was inevitable, and now that it had come, there was nothing left to fear. Back in her cell, the nature of her waiting changed. There was no longer uncertainty, only the slow, inexorable approach of an appointed day. Reverend Sullivan continued his daily visits, urging her towards spiritual peace. Over time, their conversations deepened. Marybelle began speaking more freely, not only of her crimes but of her past. The fragments of joy that had once existed, the simple dreams she had buried beneath years of hardship. She began to write again, but these were not journal entries of guilt or despair. They were letters, one for each of the families. In them, she offered what truth she could, the final words or gestures of their loved ones, the small mercies she remembered. She did not ask for forgiveness or offer excuses. Her intent was only to fill the void of not knowing. Some families refused the letters outright, wanting nothing from the woman who had destroyed their lives. Others burned them after reading, unable to bear the weight of her words. But a few, like Martha Hodges, chose to keep them. Martha later told Reverend Sullivan that, painful as it was, at least she now knew. Uncertainty, she said, is its own kind of torment. Now at least that part is over. As winter deepened and January approached, Norton slowly returned to its routines. The crowds dispersed, the newspapers found new stories, and the courthouse emptied. But something in the town's spirit had shifted. The collective innocence, the belief that such evil belonged only to distant places, was gone. People looked to the mountains differently now, aware that beauty and darkness could share the same soil. In her final weeks, Marybelle's life took on an almost monastic stillness. She rose before dawn, prayed in silence, ate sparingly, and spent her hours writing. Beyond her letters, she began composing a long, unflinching confession, a detailed account of each crime, every decision, and the reasoning she had once used to justify the unforgivable. It was not intended for the public, but for the county archives, so that future generations might understand what had happened, and perhaps learn from it. She wrote about each victim with painful precision, about how small choices became irreversible actions, and how her conscience slowly unraveled. There were no justifications left, only truth, stark, terrible, and complete. A particularly unsettling element within Marybelle's written confessions was the raw honesty with which she described her psychological decline. She recounted that after the first killing, Richard Dawson, she had spent weeks in constant fear of discovery, startled by every noise, unable to sleep. Yet when no one came, when life moved forward as though nothing had occurred, something shifted inside her. The guilt didn't vanish, but gradually gave way to a strange detachment. She began viewing her actions as though they belonged to someone else entirely, an observer trapped within her own body. That growing sense of separation made each subsequent act easier. Marybelle detailed how she could appear friendly and hospitable to strangers, pouring them tea and chatting warmly, even as another part of her mind calculated every step. She didn't deny her responsibility. She admitted each decision was deliberate, but her candor revealed how a person could live divided between two selves. By day, she was a courteous recluse. By night, she became something unrecognizable. Reverend Sullivan spent countless hours with her, reading through these writings. They disturbed him deeply, yet he couldn't turn away. It was a chilling study of how humanity fractures, how despair, isolation, and one wrong choice after another can erode morality until the person who once was no longer exists. Torn between compassion and revulsion, Sullivan struggled to offer spiritual comfort while wrestling with his own horror. During one of their last talks, Marybelle said something that would stay with him forever. What terrified her most wasn't dying or even living with guilt. It was realizing how easy it had been to cross the line. She told him she hadn't been born a monster, just an ordinary woman who met extraordinary circumstances and made devastating choices. If that was true for her, then it could be true for anyone. Within every person, she said, exists both light and darkness, and circumstance determines which side prevails. That notion unsettled everyone who heard it. People wanted to believe Marybelle was fundamentally different, someone whose cruelty made her inhuman. But her words suggested otherwise, that the boundary between normalcy and depravity was far thinner than anyone liked to admit. It didn't excuse her, but it shattered the comforting simplicity of good versus evil. The families of her victims reacted in different ways. Martha Hodges saw some faint value in understanding Marybelle's state of mind. It offered a framework, however bleak, for making sense of the senseless. Others saw it only as manipulation, one last attempt to gain sympathy. Leonard Monroe's sister refused to read a single word, insisting that no explanation could undo the destruction left in her brother's absence. As the execution date neared, Sheriff Pritchard made the necessary arrangements. A professional hangman from a nearby county arrived 3 days early to inspect the structure and calculate the drop based on Marybelle's weight and height. He performed his duties with the cool precision of routine, though he admitted privately that executing a woman always unsettled him more than a man. Something he couldn't justify logically, but felt instinctively. Marybelle's final night passed in quiet wakefulness. Reverend Sullivan stayed by her side for most of it, reading scripture and praying softly. She remained calm, calmer than he expected. She said she was ready, that she had carried her burden long enough, and that perhaps death might finally bring the peace her conscience had denied her. She didn't expect divine forgiveness, but she hoped at least for silence, an end to the unending weight of remorse. Before dawn, she made one last request, that her writings be kept intact after her death, not as spectacle but as warning. She wanted future generations to see how loneliness could corrode the human spirit, how neglect and isolation could turn broken souls into monsters. If her story could move even one person to show compassion to someone in despair, perhaps some meaning could be salvaged from all that horror. Sullivan promised to do what he could, though he doubted the world would treat her writings with such reverence. More likely, they would become fodder for public fascination rather than a moral lesson. Still, he gave his word, offering her this small solace before the end. When morning came, bringing the day of execution, Marybelle sat quietly on her bunk, hands folded, eyes closed in still prayer. She had slept little, yet appeared strangely composed, her expression one of distant peace, as though she had already stepped halfway out of the world. At sunrise, Sheriff Pritchard entered her cell. He offered her the traditional final meal, but she declined, requesting only a glass of water. As he gently explained what would happen next, she listened attentively, nodding to show understanding. Behind the courthouse, a simple wooden scaffold stood, assembled during the night and checked repeatedly for safety. Every element had been measured with grim precision to ensure no suffering would be prolonged. A dull, grey sky cast a cold light over the courtyard, the world itself seeming to acknowledge the gravity of what was about to occur. Fewer than 20 witnesses had been permitted, per the sheriff's orders. Among them were Martha Hodges and Lynette Monroe's sister, dressed in mourning black, faces pale with quiet resolve. Prosecutor Blackwood and Judge Morrison stood nearby, fulfilling their official duties, while a few local journalists had been allowed to attend under strict decorum. Reverend Sullivan took his place near the scaffold, honoring his promise to remain until the end. When Marybelle was led from her cell by the sheriff and 2 deputies, she moved steadily, the chains on her ankles clinking softly. She wore the same dark dress from her trial, and for the first time in memory, her hair hung loose about her shoulder. Her hair fell freely around her shoulders in dark, loose waves. There was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, a calm acceptance that sharply contrasted with the fear many had expected to witness. At the base of the scaffold, she paused and turned toward those gathered. Her eyes briefly met Martha Hodges's, and in that fleeting exchange, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding beyond words. Then Marybelle looked to Sheriff Pritchard and gave a small nod, signaling that she was ready. The sheriff asked if she wished to make any final statement. Marybelle inhaled deeply before speaking, her voice steady and clear in the cold morning air. She said she sought no forgiveness, knowing none could be granted for what she had done. She acknowledged the immense pain she had inflicted on innocent families and admitted that no words could undo or lessen that harm. She hoped, however, that her story might stand as a warning of what isolation and a lack of human compassion could do to a person. But she made no attempt to use it as justification. Turning her gaze toward the victims' families, Marybelle said she would carry the faces of those she had wronged with her into whatever came after death, and that this was as it should be. She thanked Reverend Sullivan for his kindness, though she confessed she was uncertain she deserved it. Finally, her eyes drifted to the distant line of mountains rising beyond the town's rooftops. She said she had once loved those hills deeply, before they became silent witnesses to her sins. Her voice trembled slightly as she concluded simply, "I'm ready." The executioner moved forward with quiet professionalism, positioning her carefully. Reverend Sullivan stepped closer and murmured a final prayer, his words soft and urgent, asking for mercy upon a tormented soul. Marybelle's lips moved in silence, perhaps repeating his words, perhaps offering her own farewell to a world that had never fully understood her, nor she it. The act itself was swift and without spectacle. There was no shouting, no unnecessary delay. The executioner performed his duty with practiced precision, and within minutes, it was finished. Marybelle Carter, who had lived 33 years among these mountains, who had known both tenderness and torment, and who had destroyed the lives of others along the way, was gone. Her remains were released to the county for burial in an unmarked section of the local cemetery. There would be no headstone, no monument, no name, only the anonymity of the forgotten. As the witnesses dispersed, each carried their own private reckoning of what they had seen. Martha Hodges lingered the longest, staring at the empty platform. She tried to decide whether justice had truly been served, or if such a thing could ever exist. In the end, she concluded there was no closure to be found, only endurance, and the slow process of living on with a wound that time would never completely heal. In the following weeks, life in Norton slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The journalists filed their final reports and moved on to new headlines. The victims' families went home, forever changed, determined not to let grief wholly define their remaining years. The mountain cabin was burned on the county's orders, its smoke curling into the cold grey sky like a final exorcism of what had happened there. Reverend Sullivan kept his word, submitting Marybelle's writings to the county archives with a note explaining their intended purpose as a lesson rather than a spectacle. In the years that followed, historians and psychologists occasionally studied them, debating questions of morality, accountability, and the limits of the human mind. Yet for the people of Norton, Marybelle Carter faded into legend, a grim whisper passed through generations, a cautionary tale the locals seldom spoke aloud. The Appalachian Mountains remained unchanged, silent, vast, and indifferent. Their forests and valleys still cradled secrets too deep to ever be fully uncovered. New settlers built homes, travelers crossed their ridges, and life continued its endless cycle. But those who remembered Marybelle's story never looked upon those mountains in quite the same way again. Hidden in that tragedy was a truth few wanted to confront, that her story wasn't only about one woman's descent into evil, but also about a community's failure to see and save her before the darkness took hold. It didn't absolve her, but it revealed how neglect, loneliness, and small choices left unchallenged could shape the unimaginable. Even now, more than a century later, travelers who hike those trails seldom know what took place there in 1921. The world has changed beyond recognition. Technology, communication, and progress have reshaped daily life, but human nature remains unaltered. We still carry within us both mercy and malice, empathy and apathy, redemption and ruin. The story of Marybelle Carter endures as a reminder that evil rarely begins in spectacle. It grows quietly, fed by isolation, despair, and indifference, until it emerges fully formed. It is also a plea for compassion, for the responsibility we share in ensuring no one falls so far unseen. The mountains of Virginia keep this memory, as they do countless others, unmoving and eternal, witnesses to the best and worst of humankind. And when the winter fog drifts through the valleys and the wind murmurs through the ancient trees, one might imagine the mountains still remember, that somewhere deep within their shadows, echoes of that long-ago tragedy still linger, whispering of the moment when humanity faltered and darkness prevailed. If you've followed this story through its final chapter, share your thoughts below. Even the darkest histories remind us of how fragile our humanity can be, and how vital it is to reach for compassion before despair takes root. Subscribe to the channel for more journeys into history's forgotten corners, and stay tuned for the next story from the shadows of the past.